So I'll kick us off this morning. Welcome, everyone. I see we have a pretty nice crowd. My name is Stan Ahalt. I'm the PI of the HEAL Data Stewardship Group, or HEAL Stewards for short. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for the fourth installment in our Fresh Fair webinar series. I almost said fresh air because I'm so accustomed to saying that. Today's webinar is called Following the HEAL Blueprint for Managing and Sharing Data. And we'll focus on describing the key elements of the HEAL public access and data sharing policy, as well as how to strengthen your data management and sharing plans. This webinar will consist of a presentation followed by a conversation with two real HEAL investigators, which is really great, and then live Q&A. If at any point you have a question, feel free to go and type it into the Q&A box. We're joined today by two wonderful HEAL investigators, Steve Johnson and Janelle Fedler. Dr. Johnson is a professor in the Department of Population Health at NYU's Long and Health. His research involves designing and evaluating information systems in patient care, clinical research, and basic research. So important applications of this work includes development of information systems to support data management, sharing, and discovery, and the use of natural language processing to extract information from unstructured biomedical text to support data analysis and decision-making. Janelle Fedler, Dr. Fedler has her doctorate in biostatistics from the University of Iowa in 2017 and is currently the Director of Biostatistics and Data Sharing at the Clinical Trial Statistical and Data Management Center, the CTS-DMC, at the University of Iowa. As part of this role, Dr. Fedler provides oversight of the sharing of data for all ongoing studies at the CTS-DMC, where she has coordinated the sharing of several data sets. She specializes in all aspects of clinical studies from the design, data management, analysis, and data sharing, and has served as a biostatistician for a number of clinical studies. And last but not least, leading us through this webinar today is HEAL Steward, Kira Bradford. Dr. Bradford is a senior technical and research scientist at the Renaissance Computing Institute, or REDC, and she works at the intersection between cloud-based cyber infrastructure development and scientific research. She is co-PI for the NIH HEAL Data Stewards and for the RENCI team on NHLBI Biodata Catalyst project. Her team science background combined with her professional and research experiences provide a foundation for her work as a leader in multidisciplinary and multi-institutional projects that accelerate research by enabling access to computational cloud-based resources. So thank you all for allowing me to kick this off. And I unfortunately have to go off to another another NIH workshop. But Kira, please take it away, and thank you for letting me be here.
Thank you for the introduction, Stan. As Dan mentioned, today's webinar is focused on following the HEAL blueprint for managing and sharing data. So with that in mind, these are the following objectives for today. So throughout my presentation, I will be highlighting the key elements of the HEAL public access and data sharing policy and providing resources to help HEAL investigators to build a stronger data management and sharing plan. All of this will allow you to be better prepared for the new NIH-wide 2023 data management and sharing policy coming next year, next January. And at the very end, as a special bonus, we have two HEAL investigators who are going to be sharing their insights about the value of a well-crafted data management and sharing plan. So if no one has said this to you yet, welcome to the new year, 2022. New year, new you, new data management and sharing plan. Well, let's try and strengthen them a little bit first. So why is it important to have a well-crafted HEAL blueprint for managing and sharing data? Let's take an example from everyday life. Well, maybe not every day, but let's imagine that you are designing your dream house and you have bought a generous half-acre to acre lot. You've recently returned to Greece and are super inspired by the Grecian architecture you saw there. So you are designing your house and you're thinking through what it's going to look like, what it's going to incorporate, multiple bedrooms, multiple bathrooms. But as you design this blueprint for your dream house, it's important to take into consideration key details. So in addition to the number of bedrooms and bathrooms, you need to be thinking about plumbing and electricity and the foundation. And also, how are the doors going to open? And where are the stairs are going to go? Because if you don't carefully think through these details, you could end up with a scenario of one of those pictures on the right. The first being, I think a lot of us have encountered unfortunate stairways, which are either far too shallow, far too steep, or overall just deadly. But say perhaps you thought through your dream house interior extremely well, and this isn't a problem for you, except maybe you forgot about the exterior as well, and you end up with a situation with those windows, 4 windows stacked on top of each other. So just like following a blueprint for managing your house is important, you should also be thinking about following a blueprint for managing and sharing your data. So what is involved with crafting a HEAL data management and sharing plan? Well, to start off, there is already guidance provided from the HEAL office through the HEAL Public Access and Data Sharing Policy. And so this policy stipulates that all HEAL investigators in their data management and sharing plans should address these 2 main elements, how they're going to handle release of publications and how they're going to handle sharing their underlying primary data. So I just want to remind everyone, before you start getting a little nervous about some requests that we may be making of you, keep in mind your HEAL data management and sharing plans are not supposed to be much longer than 1 to 2 pages, generally speaking. So let's dive into the HEAL policy. So for the release of publications, HEAL investigators are expected to describe 3 main things: how they intend to make their publications immediately available to the public, what methods they're going to be using to make those research publications available, and if there are any limitations to making the publications broadly and widely accessible. The second element deals with the sharing of underlying primary data, and there are sort of 6 sub-elements that HEAL investigators need to address in their data management and sharing plans. So first, what type of data are you expecting to be generating throughout the lifetime of your study? And second, it's totally acknowledged that the data that you may be generating in your study may not all be acceptable for broad sharing and reuse. So what type of data do you intend to share? Next, who's going to have access to the data? When is the data going to be shared? What methods will you be using to make the data shared? And if there are any limitations or anticipated limitations for why you may not be able to share your data. We acknowledge that there are some NIH HEAL awards that do not specify that your data need to be shared. And so there are some exceptions to this rule. But generally, unless your award says otherwise, we broadly encourage HEAL investigators to consider what data can be shared. So the NIH, the HEAL office, and the HEAL Data Stewardship Group have put together a pool of resources to help you answer each of these questions in the kind of detail that we're hoping to see. And to summarize it and give you a handy dandy checklist to help you strengthen your current HEAL data management and sharing plan, here are some items to consider. So first, defining data type. So you may have a data management and sharing plan that is a simple 2 to 3 sentence paragraph where you say you're generating genomic data, you're studying rats, and you intend to share your data immediately when your study publication is released. Some ways to update or upgrade or strengthen that data management and sharing plan is to define, okay, so you're doing genomics data, that's great, you're specifying modality. How big of a data set are you generating? How many files? What type of files? Are there going to be any aggregation of that data? Are you going to do study subject level or are you going to do an aggregate? And then how processed is the data that you will ultimately end up going to be sharing? Well, what will that look like? So the second bullet point is identifying data or metadata standards being used. So some of you are working in fields that there are specific identifiers or ontologies that are used widely within the field. It is perfectly awesome to specify that within your data management and sharing plan. If you're planning on using a HEAL common data element, please also specify that in your data management and sharing plan. Next, something that'll help you determine exactly how researchers and other broad public members may be able to get access to your data is specifying where your data is going to end up. So in previous webinars, in the repository webinar that Alex Waldrop presented, he gave you a handy dandy HEAL Stewards Repository Selection Quiz. So this quiz is a series of simple yes and no questions, and it'll provide you guidance on which repository may be best fit for your data. The list of repositories that the quiz provides you with are all validated and approved by the NIH HEAL officials. So feel free to take a look at that and let us know if you have any questions. Finally, once you've selected your repository, take a look at that repository. Are there any guidance for how you should be formatting your data? And does it require you to register your metadata and or your data sooner rather than later? If you, as you go through your plan, please also include language to update your plan throughout the lifetime of your study, and then also specify exactly how you're going to time your data submission to be simultaneous with your publication submission. And if all this sounds extremely burdensome and you're kind of lost and you would rather just go to a tool that has a template to help you work through it, there are tools available such as dmptool.org, and many institutions have already set up accounts with that tool. So you could use a template through that instead. So if you follow the checklist and you update your HEAL data management and sharing plan, not only will your plan be stronger, but now you are better positioned for the NIH-wide policy for data management and sharing, which is coming in 2023. So rather than go through each of the individual elements associated with this data management and sharing plan, here is a simplified chart. So you can see on the left, we have specific plan elements, such as specifying data type, what data or metadata standards you intend to use, what data repository your data will ultimately end up being in, how you intend to provide access or distribute your data broadly, and if there are any considerations for reuse. And then finally, oversight of data management and sharing plans, which includes, are you going to be updating it regularly, and maybe naming a person whose role it is to do the oversight. And so you can see that the HEAL policy and the NIH-wide policy are well in alignment. So if you follow these guidelines, you will be well positioned for the upcoming changes. So we talked a lot about the HEAL policy and how to strengthen your plans, but some of you may be left wondering, why should I? What value is there in doing this? Fair question. So I have a confession. I am a biochemist by training, and I have submitted many grants that require data management and sharing plans. And typically my data were a bunch of TIFF files and CSV files. And I said something along the lines of, I intend to share any and all data once I publish my research to any investigators who inquire. I did not really specify what data I was generating. I did not specify if there were any standard formats that I was following. I did not specify what metadata I was going to be collecting. And because I didn't think through this ahead of time, what I found is after I moved on from that lab is that my collaborators and the folks who were carrying on the project after me were left scrambling, trying to get me to answer a whole bunch of questions as I was leaving the lab. So let's agree to not let that happen in HEAL. We all know that HEAL is focusing on a very important problem. Opioid use disorder and pain management are both crises that we're trying to address. So let's begin with data sharing in mind and think about not only completing their studies and figuring out either novel treatments or new devices or whatever your research is focusing on, but also think about how that data could be potentially reused to accelerate research in the future. So there are three main points of the value in a well-crafted plan that I want to highlight. The first is knowing what is required and preparing ahead of time. So once you have chosen a repository that you ultimately plan to have your data stored in, it's helpful to look into that repository and understand what formats, what data standards or metadata standards that may be required. You don't want to get to the end of your study having generated all this data and realize, oh, you need to fix some of the formatting. Second bullet point is revisiting the plan and updating it. So let's go back to the dream house analogy for a second. Let's say you carefully crafted your blueprint. It is beautiful, it is gorgeous, it specifies every detail from the rooftop to the foundation. You hand over your blueprint to the builders, and then you come back in a year after the house is built. How do you think that house is going to turn out? Typically, most people would agree that you need to Visit that site regularly to ensure that your builders are following that blueprint, because sometimes there are going to be things that need to be adjusted in real time. So all this to say that the HEAL data management and sharing plan that you craft should not be considered a static document. It is a living document that should change and evolve as your study evolves. It may be that you are part of a multi-site study and you identify that there is a certain variable term that needs to be adjusted for whatever reason. And if you all don't agree to have that metadata variable term adjusted, then that could lead into variables that are not usable, and that would lead to data that's not usable. So take the opportunity to revisit the plan as your study evolves, and also use revisiting the plan as a way to ensure that everyone on your study team is on the same page and knows what the expectations are for sharing your data. And a note about when you should be reviewing your data management and sharing plan. Obviously, you will have already written a HEAL data management and sharing plan. And so after writing upon an application, you should also consider reviewing it when you're preparing to share your data, when you're generating data, when you're preparing to share your data, and when the sharing data and publishing results, if there are any at any time new lab members or collaborators have been onboarded. And the final point in the value of a well-crafted data management sharing plan is to begin a study with data sharing in mind. And for those of you who have read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, this sounds a lot like begin with the end in mind. And I know for many investigators, when they begin a study, they have a specific target in mind. They want to come up with a new therapy. They want to come up with a new drug. They want to come up with a new device that'll help. But it's also helpful to take into consideration what that data should look like if you are intending to share it with future collaborators or people that you may not even have thought of yet. So use the development of the data sharing plan as a tool to build consensus within your multi-PI studies. As an example, let's say you're part of a multi-site study and all sites have need to have a specific file format, and there's only a certain specific software that can generate that file format. So it is important to specify what that is and that everyone's on the same page and everyone can generate that file format. So let's summarize what we learned today. Takeaways: begin a study with data sharing in mind, and know what is required for sharing your data and preparing ahead of time. Plan to revisit the plan and update it as your study evolves, and everyone will benefit. HEAL investigators and the HEAL Initiative from having well-crafted data management and sharing plans. And if at any point you have questions or you need support, HEAL data stewards are here to help in any way we can. So now I will invite my 2 panelists to join us, and I'll ask them to turn on their cameras as I stop sharing my screen. And we will begin with some questions. All right, so first question: what is your experience with creating a data management and sharing plan on behalf of a consortium or a multiple PI group? And Janelle, please go first.
Hi everyone. My experience in creating data management and sharing plans has been for multi-site clinical trials. The data sharing process, beginning with drafting the data management and sharing plan, is a collaborative activity at the center. Our approach to creating the plans is to write them as a study team with input from the protocol investigator, data managers, the statisticians, the grant managers, and other team members. So really everybody contributing. As with most operations, doing things as a team has several benefits versus a sole individual being responsible. This allows everyone on the study to actively participate in the data sharing process and provide input based on their expertise. It also ensures the structure of our plans are consistent across our studies. When creating the data management and sharing plans, we refer to the funding announcement or grant award, as this usually has several details designated that are incorporated into the plan, such as where the study data will be shared. For our NIH HEAL study, we have been working with the data stewards to choose an appropriate repository, like many of you have been. So this has been a bit of a new pathway for us versus our standard process.
Steve, do you want to share your insights?
Sure. NYU is the data coordinating center for EpicNet. We have a data management group here at NYU called DataCore. DataCore supports clinical trials by developing standard operating procedures and templates for various aspects of studies. This would include data management and sharing plans. These various materials help us coordinate the roles of different stakeholders, the clinical coordinating center, study sites, investigators, data managers, and analysts. To develop templates like this, we draw on principles of good clinical data management practices. For example, the templates help us prompt and facilitate discussion with our stakeholders about essential data management topics that include data flow, data quality, security, data sharing, and archival.
Thanks, Steve. So it sounds like you had some in-house resources that you could pull from. So that's a very good consideration for those of us who are listening on the call. You may look at your own institution and see if there are in-house resources available to help you strengthen your plan. So moving on to the next question. All right, so from your all's perspective, what are some of the benefits and value added by having a well-crafted data management and sharing plan in place? Janelle, please begin.
Some of the benefits of having a data management and sharing plan in place are being able to plan in advance for what will be required in terms of data sharing and making sure you are in compliance with your grant conditions. In terms of value added, thinking about data sharing at the beginning of your study could potentially impact the data collection. For example, while designing your data collection forms, you may incorporate common data elements or employ other strategies such as limiting the collection of identifying information, avoiding text fields, and collecting continuous rather than categorical versions of your data.
Steve?
I make an analogy for DSMPs to when we develop software and you need to develop specifications, and the better your specifications are, the better your software is. So these plans are similar in helping us conduct studies. They formalize the roles, functions, pathways for managing data, how to standardize data elements, and defining our metadata. For example, one of the things that we try to do in plans is what transformations might need to be performed on data that when we receive it in order for the data to meet target standards for storage and sharing. Where possible, we try to draw on existing standard operating procedures that already exist, and we adapt these and incorporate their language into the plan.
I really like that software analogy, Steve, because it makes me think that one of the things that I hope that everyone takes away from this is that a data management and sharing plan is more than just making sure you have an idea of what's going to happen, but it's also taking some time to think about future-proofing your data. All right, so what are some of the most important elements of a data management and sharing plan? What do you think, Janelle?
Some of the most important elements to include in your plan are where the data will be shared, the timeline for sharing, and what data and documents will be shared. So data sharing is more than just submitting raw data sets in a data dictionary. You should include any information that would be useful to an external investigator using your data. So in addition to the data and data dictionary, this could include items like annotated case report forms, endpoint scoring information, the protocol and summary of changes, a statistical analysis plan, or a README file describing the study in the documents that are going to be shared. All these documents need to be described in your data sharing plan, and everything that is shared needs to be thoroughly reviewed and validated by the study team. And then also I would note that as part of the new NIH policy on data management and sharing, there's a supplement provided that designates important elements to include that I would recommend utilizing.
I'm just going to echo that I am all for data dictionaries and README files. I think there's many of us that have been on the suffering end of receiving data and you had no idea what you just got. Steve, did you want to share some of your insights?
Sure. Similar to what you showed earlier, Kira, there's the who, what, when, where aspect. The who, responsible parties for sending and receiving and validating the data. What kinds of data modalities do you have, file types, controlled vocabularies? When does the study begin and end? What are time points within the study, frequency of transmission? Where is the data coming from? Where is it going to? Are there, what tools are you doing to do that? Is there centralized vendor tool, a site-based tool, patient-based tools? And finally, how you're collecting the data, transferring it, validating it, sharing and storing.
All right, so I got to ask Steve, this sounds like a lot of information to include in a data management and sharing plan. Is your data management and sharing plan more than 1 to 2 pages?
Yeah, so these, I'm just describing much more detail than what you were showing before, which focuses more on the ultimate sharing for downstream consumption. So these elements we need for running the study.
That's fair. And I will note for those of you on the call, if it seems like these two that are with me on the panel are just like superstars with respect to data management and sharing plans, they're both part of clinical studies, which definitely need to make sure they have a well-crafted plan in place. All right. So many lessons to be learned from them. All right, next question. So how does developing a data management and sharing plan tie into making data more useful and usable for others prior to sharing?
So at the beginning of the study, and while the study is ongoing, we always try to keep in the back of our minds how study decisions could impact data sharing. So we keep note of important information to share later on, like changes in our data collection forms or items that may come up during analysis. And the study team reviews the data sharing plan periodically, like Kira recommended, to make any necessary updates, which could be based on some of this information that we note. So more pragmatically, developing a data management and sharing plan ensures you are properly budgeted for the tasks required for data sharing for your study. One example is the timeline for data sharing. Perhaps it's required that the data for your study is shared periodically while the study is ongoing and at the end of the study. This would require an increased amount of effort as compared to end of study sharing only.
So Janelle, I gotta ask, have you ever in your work encountered a situation where you had to make changes to your study that could potentially impact how data sharing could happen?
Yeah, well, a great example is right now with our NIH HEAL study, we are updating our data repository that we'll be sharing our data at. So,
yeah, so does that mean you have new standards you need to take into account, or what is that? What do those changes mean?
Yeah, so we're working with the HEAL stewards and Kira and researching other repositories, and then eventually we'll be working to update our plan.
Awesome. All right, Steve, I'm going to repeat the question just in case. So the question is, whoops, I think I lost my notes. There we go. How does developing a data management and sharing plan tie into making data more useful and usable for others prior to sharing?
So for us, the plan helps to clarify features and functions of the whole data management lifecycle. So from beginning to end, and defining the characteristics of the data that we're going to share. We try to create infrastructure upfront for data collection using common data elements across our trials. So not just for one trial, but across trials. In this way, the data are collected consistently across trials, makes them more suitable for sharing. As a sort of counterexample, in past experience, when we didn't follow this approach, a lot of problems can come up. For example, you can be in a situation where different sites are sending you data in different ways, and then what you have to do is afterwards, you have to do integration and clean up on the central platform, which creates a lot more work later on.
All right, thanks, Steve. So I'll move on to our final question, and I promise I'll stop changing the slides. So Janelle, what is your experience and advice, any advice you may have for sharing sensitive data?
So all of my data sharing experience has been with human subject data and thus handling sensitive data. So I've coordinated the sharing of data with a variety of data repository, and every repository has different guidelines, so it's crucial to make yourself aware of them early on. When sharing sensitive data, I would recommend repositories that have restricted access. And by restricted access, I mean requiring investigators to obtain IRB approval to obtain the data. Some repositories may have other requirements, such as limits on the data use or specifying terms on data destruction. If you have especially sensitive data, there may be different access tiers available at a repository to access the data. Some minimal level of de-identification should be performed for sensitive data. This is another area where we take a collaborative approach at the center. We gather input from the study team and experts in the field to determine what is potentially identifiable in our data. A standard approach of de-identification is to remove the 18 HIPAA identifiers. Some other common modifications for de-identification are to assign new de-identified participant IDs, to convert all your dates and times to a time since a reference period, such as consent or randomization in your study, removing all the comment fields, and collapsing or removing sensitive data with small counts or outliers. Your chosen repository may have specific recommendations for how to perform de-identification, which may include some or more of these approaches I just mentioned. Finally, my advice for sharing sensitive data and really data sharing in general is transparency. So external investigators can replicate your study results and understand the study to do additional valid work. So an important part of transparency is providing a linkage between the data collected in your study and the de-identified data that you share at the end.
And for those of you who are frantically taking notes, this webinar is recorded and we will be providing you the recording. Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, so my advice is for sites to draw on standard operating procedures that you may already have from other studies and adapt them as you need. These help you define how you will safeguard protected health information when you collect the data, and how to manage the different kinds of unique identifiers that you might have. One technique that we found useful in EPICNet and also other studies is the use of global unique identifiers, or GUIDs, and there are various NIH tools for generating those. And those are particularly interesting because they can help you link subjects who consent to this across different projects, which is really cool, allowing us to link data that we wouldn't otherwise be able to. Just as Janelle said, how we need methods for de-identifying data sets, which identifiers need to be removed. And another important function is re-identification. In certain studies, you need to keep track of their original identifiers and be able to map backwards in certain studies for recruitment purposes or follow-up.
All right, I gotta ask, out of curiosity, both of you have experience being part of multi-PI groups or consortia. Have you ever had a scenario where there was a PI or someone who seriously questioned why you need to be able to share the sensitive data? And how did you respond?
Thankfully, in my experience, everyone's been pretty open and glad to share their data, but it is certainly a hot topic. You want priority over your own data, and most data sharing plans do, allow you to publish your data and then share afterwards. So it shouldn't be a concern.
Yeah, we in a similar way, you try to share the least amount of identifying information necessary wherever possible. So if you could possibly get away with de-identified data, that's obviously usually the best way. But I've been in studies where you might need to say share dates because it's crucial to get the original timeline right for clinical purposes. Not do date shifting. And so that would be an example where you have a limited data set. It's rare that we would share more, that we would have studies where we would share more than that.
Thank you, guys. That was an on-the-fly question for those of you who are on the phone. I think they handled that extremely well. So thank you so much to the panelists. Hopefully I'm sharing the right screen. We will now move into the live Q&A portion of our webinar. So I will invite Cindy and Taunton to also turn on their cameras. So you have heard from me and from Janelle and Steve. So Cindy Danielson is the Associate Director, Systems Integration, Office of Research, Reporting and Analysis, and also of the Office of Extramural Research. We also have Taunton Payne, who's the Director of the Scientific Data Sharing Policy Division and the Office of Science Policy. Both of these wonderful people are excellent resources if you have any questions pertaining to the 2023 NIH wide data sharing policy. So first question, let's see. For Taunton, do researchers need to retroactively update their data management and sharing plans when the new NIH-wide policy goes into effect next January?
That's a great question. Thank you. So the way that the new data management and sharing policy works is that it applies to new and competing awards that were submitted for the January 25th, 2023 receipt date and going forward. So if you have a award that had an earlier receipt date than that, you won't actually be subject to the policy until your next competing renewal. So if we do have a situation where people in the future might be under both the HEAL policy and the NIH data management and sharing policy, generally speaking, the way this works, and this is true of any data sharing policy that we might have or any expectation found in an FOA or NOA, is that the data management and sharing policy sort of sets the floor. And in other cases, we may sort of go beyond that on a program level or on an IC level, or for certain types of research or certain types of data, for example, under the NIH genomic data sharing policy.
Awesome. Next question, also for Taunton and maybe for Cindy as well. Is sharing tools, software, and code a requirement for the new NIH-wide policy? So for example, would awarded studies that are not actively generating data but are developing software be required to share their code or their tools?
So the policy doesn't directly require people to share software, code, or tools. What it expects is the submission of a data management and sharing plan. But in that plan, there is a place in the recommended elements that was actually mentioned earlier that relates to sort of software, code, or tools that may be needed to access or sort of manipulate or actually analyze data that are to be shared and kind of where they can be found. So it's not saying necessarily that you need to tell us where you're going to share it or expect you to share it, but rather that you tell us sort of what did you use, what's necessary here, and where can it be found.
Thank you for that clarification. I also was wondering. Next question. So it looks like it could be for Steve, and Janelle could probably share some insights as well. Steve, could you describe some benefits and success cases related to engaging with librarians in the creation and revision of data management and sharing plan?
Yeah, great question. So we work really closely with our health sciences library at NYU. They've really been really at the forefront of thinking about this and certainly helping us prepare for the coming year to meet that requirement. We at NYU, they have a tool called the NYU Data Catalog, and that is one of our early examples of tools for using metadata to help share data sets, both locally and nationally. So we couldn't do this without the library.
Out of curiosity, do you specify in your data management and sharing plans that you utilize your health science library resources?
You know, I'm not sure that they do get that direct credit. I'll have to look at that.
All right, next question, also for Steve and for Janelle. So are you creating de-identified data for sharing? And if so, are you following the safe harbor method? And Steve, can you elaborate? What is the safe harbor method?
So Janelle, you already addressed this. There are these 18 identifiers that you need to remove from your data set, and then it's considered safe for sharing at that point.
And I would just echo that. I would refer to your repository guidelines as they'll probably designate removing the 18 HIPAA identifiers, but also may have additional guidelines.
Next question for Taunton. Do data management plans have to be submitted and approved by NIH whenever changes are made?
Yes, generally what the policy says is that, there should be approval from NIH on this. Cindy, did you want to add anything about that?
Sure, I'll just add that because these plans, they will become a term and condition of your award, we really do want them to be taken seriously. So if something changes that will affect the plan that has been submitted and approved, yes, you would need to submit a revised plan and then make sure that NIH will take a look at that and approve that, and then you'll be held to that updated version of the plan moving forward.
That makes a ton of sense. I do wonder though, part of this webinar is encouraging people to revisit and update their plans as the study evolves. And so I think this is a question for the broader group, but for Steve and Janelle, how often would you say you've had to update your plan throughout the lifetime of your study? And then for Taunton and Cindy, is the new NIH-wide policy allowing for some flexibility or an agile way to quickly approve these changes? So let's first hear from Steve and Janelle.
Okay, I'll go first. So as you can see, at NYU, we're using plans for the whole data lifecycle and not just the ultimate sharing. And so for those local aspects that are important to how we're conducting the study, there can be quite a number of frequent changes. I think that typically the ultimate destination of data and the other factors that you were talking about, Kira, those are rarely change. For example, if you've picked a repository, it's unlikely that you change that. So it's more for us the local management of data aspects that change.
And Janelle, how about for you? How often would you say you've had to update your plan?
I would agree with Steve. The major elements of the plans are pretty solid. We more refer to them at the key points that you highlighted in your presentation. At the beginning of the study, when you're creating them, after when you're preparing for data collection, and then towards the end of the study when you're thinking about publication timelines and referring to it then.
All right, so for Taunton and Cindy, is there any flexibility in submitting your revised plan, or how is NIH proposing to be agile in handling any changes in these plans?
Cindy, do you want to take that?
Yeah, so in general, this will vary depending on your project, and it's really helpful, especially that Janelle and Steve have mentioned that overall the kind of the larger elements don't change so much. And so you'll really need to take a look at your individual case and see, for example, if it's something large, like for some reason you need to change the intended repository, that's something that would certainly affect everything. So that's something you'd want to put through a revised plan. Whereas other changes, they may not be large enough or even be in there. So it's a little hard to say how this would work for everyone. But in general, we're definitely conscious of the need for these plans to actually reflect reality. And We don't have any specifics on how often you can submit a plan. It's really going to depend on your individual needs, but we do want that to reflect the reality of your research. And so we're certainly not, limiting this to you must have this plan for a whole life of your project or even a year, something like that.
Awesome. All right. So the next question is for Taunton and Cindy. Is there a standard timeline for sharing data? So many PIs publish on a rolling basis. Do they decide when they're ready, or are they held to a timeline following close to the end of the study?
Great question. So the policy lays out essentially two sort of different timelines here. So when you've drafted a plan and your plan proposes to share certain types of data, if those data end up underlying publications, the policy expects that those data will be shared at the time of publication and sort of no later than. And similarly, if those data do not end up being the subject of publications, for example, if they're sort of significant null results or something like that, that they would be shared by the end of the period of performance, so the end of the grant, essentially.
All right. Question for Taunton and Cindy. Do we only need to submit data that may be published, or are there other recommendations for other data that has been generated but not necessarily published on?
So I think I got to this a little bit in my last question, but the definition of scientific data, which is really what the policy kind of hinges on and is what we want people to sort of plan for the sharing of, doesn't necessarily underlie publication per se. Other data can also be shared, and it may be appropriate to do so. The example I gave was sort of null results. So I think when you're developing your plan in the beginning, you may not know necessarily exactly what are going to underlie publications or not, but you would still be proposing which data you're going to be generating and sharing. And I think the question of whether it underlies publication or not is really more relevant to sort of when it should be shared.
I gotcha. Okay. Next question is for everybody to answer, so I'll call on each of you. So be ready. Considering all the involved parts, what is your estimate of the total number of hours going into developing a well-crafted data management and sharing plan? So before the data is collected and throughout the lifetime of the project. I'm going to give everyone a second, and I'm going to start with Steve.
So the first time you do this, if you've never done one before, it's a substantial time investment, many hours, and often multiple stakeholders are involved in crafting the different pieces of it. Once you've got experience developing these and you've developed a sort of a library of plans, if you will, it gets a lot easier because a lot of components are reusable across studies. So. But you have to prepare for that first time you do it for significant time investment.
Janelle, do you agree with Steve?
I would agree with Steve. And then also there are a lot of resources available now for you to use in crafting your plans. And so that'll help ease that burden at the beginning of creating your initial plan.
And for Taunton and Cindy, does that jive with kind of what you were expecting?
Yeah, I mean, I think, an important thing to consider here is that there's probably going to be substantial variation across project type, across discipline, preclinical studies where things may be relatively more straightforward. There may not be as many, issues around sort of de-identification and privacy protection and limitations on subsequent reuse, especially I think also in fields that have a long history of sharing data already, where there may be a lot of pathways that already exist. Things can be simpler, so it may not be as difficult, or sort of require as much time as some of our kind of more complicated human subjects research involving multiple sites with very substantial data generation.
Yeah, just to remind everyone, HEAL is a very diverse initiative. So we have well over 600 different studies funded with over 20 different data types being generated across 8 different species. So we recognize, and this is why we're not recommending a single template fits all, but giving you general guidance on how to strengthen your current data management and sharing plan. All right, Don, you're still in the hot spot. So how would you define a finite study that requires an individual data management and sharing plan, say several projects under one grant?
Well, I think what the policy asks for is that, a plan be submitted with an application for funding. So I think the core piece is going to be the grant. So the plan may very well have to address sort of multiple projects and, multiple activities going on under the same project. Cindy, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, so that's true that we will need a plan at the grant level. And so if there are multiple studies, we certainly know that in some cases, an individual grant will be generating multiple data types, for example. There may be different ways to organize that content because a lot of the information that would be expected, the elements of a plan would vary by study or by data type. And so at least initially, we kind of have to leave this open so that you can fill that out in the way that works for the exact type of science that you are doing. Hopefully that helps.
Thank you for that clarification. So the next question is, are there pre-approved repositories for sharing data? So I'm going to give a shout out to the HEAL Stewards Repository Selection Quiz. The HEAL Stewards have created a list of vetted repositories that is still being updated, modulated. It's a evolving list, but taking the quiz will give you an idea of which repositories that are generally approved by NIH may be a good fit for your data. And that will be a link that is included in your resources section of the email to follow after this webinar. All right, taking a look at questions. So I see one comment on here that I find interesting. The policy expectation that data be shared no later than the end of the funded period is a significant change. Taunton or Cindy, do you want to comment on that?
Sure. So, I think the point here is that, data that might meet the definition of scientific data, being that it's sort of necessary to validate and replicate research findings and that it's of sufficient quality to do so, and that it underlie findings. That's really what we're sort of talking about here. I want to maybe use this opportunity to clear up what I think is perhaps a misconception that the data management and sharing policies is sort of expecting people to share any data that they generate, of any type. That's not the case. We're expecting people to sort of look at that definition and think about their research question that they're asking and the activities that they have and sort of think about what are their scientific data in this particular context. And to propose, sharing those. And it may be that sometimes those data that are, being generated, and analyzed in the course of that project don't result in a peer-reviewed publication. Nevertheless, they may have substantial value. They can help to avoid. I'm thinking particularly in the case of sort of null results here. But this is something that I understand there's been some questions around this. So we do hope to be able to provide some guidance to help people think through this question of what are specifically their scientific data.
Yeah, I am really glad you talked about null results, Taunton, because I think that is a topic of consideration within the HEAL community. What do we do with the data that doesn't actually lead to a new hypothesis, but is just useful knowledge to keep in mind as you're progressing through your research? And hopefully in a couple more webinars, we'll have exciting topics related to that. Next question is very much related to what you answered, Taunton, but let's hear from Janelle and Steve. Is typically all data shared for you all, including even elements that are collected for the safe conduct of the study, such as screening for clinical depression as opposed to depression as a study-related outcome? Could you speak to how you handle these sorts of considerations in your own studies? Who wants to go first?
Let Janelle go first this
Yeah,
time.
I can go. So yeah, that's a great lead off of Taunton's talk about scientific data. So yes, we typically try to share all data that was collected, even though it may not be directly related to the goal of your study, what you're answering. It could have other uses for other investigators. The one exception to that may be if you're collecting some sort of operational data that was just, you may not include that. In terms of the specific question about screening data, yes, we would share that information. It may be useful to another investigator designing a study in the same disease area.
Yeah, we have a very similar approach, and one thing I've been advocating for here is using these plans to help you execute your study. And for that, you really want to cover everything, as we talked about, of how all aspects of managing your data from beginning to end. And I would agree where we largely err on the side of sharing everything.
All right. Looks like we are, next question. Is it understood that you don't have, it is understood that you don't have a one size fits all for data management and sharing plans, but can you share a template for metadata? All right, so I'm happy to answer this question. So there's a couple of resources to keep in mind. One, we had a metadata webinar back in November led by the HEAL stewards, John Cheadle, that talked more specifically about how to think about metadata and the different levels of metadata you may need to collect. I will also give you a brief teaser, something that is currently under development with the HEAL office and the HEAL stewards team, as well as the HEAL platform team, is a list of core study level metadata that we hope will inspire you to ensure you collect so that your data is more readily discoverable and searchable on the HEAL platform. And that is coming soon. All right, and I think that concludes, oh, awesome. We are at 1:58. I will move on to concluding remarks once I remember how to share my screen. Here we go. All right. I seem to have lost my notes, but that's okay. Okay, so thank you everyone who participated. We've received some really excellent questions. I hope that you found this useful. A special thank you for Janelle and Steve for joining us today. I am very grateful for your insights, for crafting a strong data management and sharing plan, and a very special thank you to Taunton and Cindy for fielding quite a few questions on the 2023 NIH data management policy. So for the audience, I hope that you are leaving with a better understanding of the HEAL public access and data sharing policy, and you are leaving with renewed vigor to strengthen your data management and sharing plans. In addition to a recording of this webinar, we will also email who is registered for this event a list of resources that will assist you as you participate more deeply in the HEAL ecosystem. So this slide deck will be shared, and there should be a link to our Slack channel and connect with us form either located now in the chat box or it will be popping up very shortly. We hope you will all reach out to us, the HEAL stewards, for any questions or support as you embark on your FAIR journey. And finally, we hope that you will save the date for our next webinar on February 17th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So for this webinar, we are inviting several HEAL program officers to have a conversation on data sharing, facts or fiction. So if you're leaving this webinar wondering just exactly how you will share your data, feel free to queue those questions up for some HEAL program officers. So until next time, have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. Thank you.